Okay, good morning, everyone. So in this room, good morning, gentlemen. At home, good morning at home. All right. So today we take up the next gate of the 108 Gates of Dharma-illumination, and you will recall, it's been a while since I've been in this chair, that this is a text which shows up as the 11th fascicle of the 12 fascicle version of Dogen's Shobogenzo. So this is mostly a long quote from another text called the Sutra of Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. So Dogen didn't write this list or compile this list, but he did include it, and he included some text at the end, which basically recommends we investigate all of these gates thoroughly. So I figure if it's important for him, it's probably important for us, right? So since 2016, one gate at a time, I've been talking about this. We're up to 105. The end is in sight. Okay, so the gate statement for this week. Endurance of obedient following is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we obey the Dharma of all the Buddhas. So elsewhere, this endurance of obedient following, Junin, is translated tolerance of accordance. So endurance, tolerance, patience, forbearance. Suddenly this starts to sound a bit familiar, right? The central word here is the Sanskrit kshanti, which has a root meaning of like having capacity, having the ability to function in the midst of something, right? Patience, tolerance, forbearance. So in Japanese, the endurance of obedient following is one of the gonin, the 5 kinds of endurance, or the 5 tolerances. There are myriad lists of tolerances in the Buddhist tradition, so we have to be careful not to get tangled up here. Which list of tolerances are we looking at, right? So this particular list of 5 that is related to this gate statement comes from a text called the Sutra for Humane Kings. So this is a fairly influential text in East Asia. It's supposed to be a translation of an Indian text, but as happens so often, this thing was actually written in China or in Korea. So it purports to be a translation of something from India, but not really. So technically, this is part of the Prajnaparamita literature, but actually it's a blend with Yogacara and a lot of other things, a lot of other kinds of teachings. So interestingly, this is not a text which is aimed primarily at practitioners like us, right? Either lay or ordained. It's really aimed at rulers, people who are in a position of governing. So where usually the questioners in this sutra are arhats or bodhisattvas, in this case it's kings. Right? It's rulers. And rather than overtly focusing on zazen or on wisdom or the things that we might assume or be familiar with, a sutra kind of focusing on, this thing is about humaneness and forbearance. So, these are the most applicable religious virtues if you're running a state. Right? It's not so much about zazen and all of that. It's about how do we rule in a humane way? How do we have forbearance? So I'll come back to that sutra shortly. We're going to dig into that a little bit about this alignment of kings and bodhisattvas in endurance and patience, right? So this text lists the 5 kinds of tolerances to be cultivated. So first one is self-control, working to just loosen the grip of the 3 poisons, right? Greed, anger, and ignorance. Second one is firm belief, or faith in the practice, faith in the 3 treasures, knowing that good deeds lead to good consequences, or we could say, right, belief in cause and effect, which happens to be a very important teaching point for Dogen in Soto Zen. Third one, patient progress toward the end of all mortality. We'll come back to that one in a minute because it's important. Fourth, the realization of the birthlessness of phenomena. So in other words, this is, in the absolute sense, there is no birth and death, there's no arising and perishing, no coming and going, right? So really realizing, deeply understanding that. Fifth one, finally, extinction. So the patience that leads to complete nirvana. So when we finally extinguish the fires of these 3 poisons that started with self-control, the first thing on the list, right? So we're kind of making full circle. So the kanji in our gate statement that are translated there as endurance of obedient following are somehow translated in this list of 5 tolerances as the third one, patient progress toward the end of all mortality. And you look at these things and go, what's the connection? We have endurance of obedient following, and we have patient progress toward the end of all mortality, and you just go, those are not the same thing, why are these connected, right? So the overall sense of this thing is being intellectually receptive to the nature of the Dharma, right? We endure or tolerate, and I love how that gets used, sort of putting aside our own views and being in reality. And sometimes that's not easy, right? We really have to endure putting aside what we think and expect and going, what's really happening? Really, dig into Zazen, opening the hand of thought. Oh, there's another way to approach my life. It's like when we come to the cushion, when we come to the practice, we think, well, there must be some other way to do this, right? I'm suffering. Something's out of whack. There must be some other way to do this. And yet, right, when we're confronted with teachings and practice and sort of challenges to our ideas about self, it's like, that's not easy. We kind of have to endure that. We kind of have to tolerate that. So, listening to, remembering what Buddha taught, and then sort of gently and patiently putting that into practice. Here's the patience piece, right? We have to sort of put ourselves into that container and into that circumstance and endure being pushed a little bit and challenged a little bit. But there's also a patience element to how do we apply these things that we are coming to understand. It's not about being tough, right? Gently and patiently. So there's this real feeling of that. There's this real sense that it's not about being a martyr. It's not about being a tough person. It's not that kind of endurance, right? So in order to get the whole picture, we need some context around this. So in early Buddhist teachings, patience was about following a linear path through certain kinds of trainings, right? You would do a certain kind of training, you would achieve a certain thing, you would do the next kind of training, right? So it's a bit linear. So there are stages of meditation, and you sort of climb the ladder towards something, right? Moving toward liberation, finally leaping off this wheel of life and death and rebirth and all of that. So we can see where patient progress toward the end of all mortality comes from, right? And how that's connected. So as we know, even though in Zen we hear things like, well, awakening is already here, Zazen is good for nothing, we still know practice is a lifelong endeavor, right? We need to be patient because we don't sit down once and kind of get it. So, it's not a case where, well, I get on the cushion once or twice, I have some flash, some kind of peak experience, and then I'm cooked, right? That I'm done, that I get it. There's a lot we have to learn. And there's a lot we have to unlearn, right? Unlearning can be hard. Unlearning requires some fortitude, I think. So gradually we're untwisting our karma and our delusion and our unwholesome habits that we fall back on. And then we can recognize awakening and reality and start to act on that basis. Then we've got skillful action happening, right? So we also have to bring into this conversation Shanti Paramita, right? The perfection of patience. So brief review of the paramitas, 6 paramitas, common to all of Buddhism, right? Generosity, Shila, ethical discipline, patience, there we go, patience, effort, concentration, and wisdom. So those 6 paramitas, of course, are throughout our tradition. So the paramita of patience is said to have 3 aspects. There's tolerance toward other living beings, there's tolerance of circumstances, and there's the tolerance that comes from wisdom and insight into the essence of reality and how things actually work. So tolerance toward other living beings. Well, Toda-san has explained elsewhere that in the Mahayana, in general, endurance or patience is the practice of lay people. So this is not separate from where we are. It says, in a monastery, patience is not considered so important because monks are assumed to have similar values and aspirations. Lay people are in greater contact with people who have different philosophies and ways of thinking. For this, they need patience. For a bodhisattva, patience is one of the most important practices. So this is assuming residential practice, right? This is assuming you're a bit away from the world. So all of us are, no matter what we're wearing, right, are householding people who are out in the world. So this really applies to all of us. We encounter various people. We encounter diversity. We need to have patience around that, right? So, this is a bit of a contrast. I'm making a bit of a contrast here. However, I got to tell you, anyone who's practiced in a training temple in Japan needs a certain amount of patience and diligence in just folding in being in accord, right? Particularly if you're a foreigner, and this is not your culture, and this is not your language, and this is not your country, And, people in the temple are just as human as everybody else. There's still squabbling, there's still disagreement. One hopes we're going to handle it skillfully, but it's a human community. So we still need patience in dealing with other people. So I think this endurance of obedient following is a real open question for us in North America. It has been, I think, since Soto Zen arrived here 100 years ago or so, in these days and circumstances, which are very different from the origins of Soto Zen. What does it look like to follow the Buddha obediently? Does it look the same as it has always looked in a different culture, in a different time? Can we keep the spirit of our ancestors and the intention of our ancestors, even though maybe our practice looks different here based on times and cultures and things that are available to us, right? So Toto-san has talked about how living in America as a foreigner requires a great deal of patience on his part. So he says, American Buddhist practitioners who practice with teachers from Japan or other Asian Buddhist countries need the same sort of patience. Actually, any two people who live or work together will sometimes have conflicts and need to practice patience. Right? So, of course, this is just one example of tolerance toward other beings. This is tolerance toward our immediate practitioners, this kind of Sangha. It's tolerance toward the greater Sangha, of all the people that we encounter. We've got plenty of personal experience being annoyed with other kinds of beings, right? Bugs, weeds in the garden. Maybe it's our noisy neighbors, it's our incompetent coworkers, it's our selfish family members, decision makers who don't do what we want, right? There's no shortage of irksome people in our lives, right? We get that, bless them, we get that opportunity all the time. You don't have to go far to encounter people that kind of put our back up a little bit, right? So tolerance of other living beings, everything from bugs in the garden to, to people working on a national scale. So second one is tolerance of circumstances. So of course, one way to understand suffering is we want things to be different than they are, right? Somehow we assume the universe has made a contract with us to do everything we want and everything we expect, and that things will go the way they're supposed to go. Well, then we find out, rude awakening. Universe doesn't care what we think. Universe is going to do what the universe does. It's just functioning in the way that it functions. Jiju Yuzamai is happening. Universe is carrying out its functions. It doesn't really care whether we like it or not. So we have to sort of adjust our thinking. So tolerance of circumstances doesn't mean we don't work for change when change is necessary. This doesn't mean we just kind of stand by and go, oh well, right? But we have to do that kind of carefully. It means we accept what's unfolding without looking away, without being in denial about what's going on, without trying to write another story to make it more palatable, to make it more acceptable. If we don't examine our circumstances carefully, if we're not paying attention to cause and effect, then we can't work for change effectively. If we don't really see what's going on, how do we know what to change? And how do we know how to change it in a way that doesn't just create more suffering? So we can't operate in accord with the Dharma, right? If we're not paying attention to circumstances, accepting circumstances, looking at them carefully, and then taking skillful action, we are not in accord with the Dharma, which points us back to this gate. Third kind of tolerance in the paramita of patience, tolerance that comes from wisdom and insight into the essence of reality. So this is the basis of it all, right? This is the basis of all of our endurance and patience and forbearance. This is real endurance of obedient following. So this is being completely in accord with the Dharma, completely in accord not only with what Buddha is teaching, but with the way the universe really functions. So the bodhisattva that embraces all these three kinds of tolerances in the paramita of patience sympathizes with living creatures, right? Really can understand their problems, perhaps sees how they think, how they respond, has some insight into what can this person take in. If I'm going to say something, like what can that person actually take in and work with? What can they process? What are the real reasons for the way this person is behaving? Can we do some discernment about, what's under that? Somebody's taking some action we are puzzled by, or we don't agree with, or that feels harmful. Okay. Recognizing our own feeling about that is important. This is not saying we suppress that, we ignore it. It's saying, and in addition, What's going on with the other person, right? Can we embody all of these three aspects of patience and really get to the bottom of what's really unfolding in front of me here? Because that's the only way we're going to know how to make some skillful response. So, endurance of obedient following is a gate of Dharma-illumination, for with it we obey the Dharma of all the Buddhas. So, obeying the Dharma of all the Buddhas is the same kanji as obedient following. So both halves of these statements are sort of parallel, right? In other words, being in accord with the teachings of our ancestors means being in accord with reality. So if we're listening to Buddha, we're paying attention to what Buddha's teaching, we move toward being in accord with what's actually going on. So let's return to this Sutra for Humane Kings that I mentioned a minute ago, that listed the 5 kinds of tolerance, including the one that we're dealing with here. So the text sets up a parallel or a similarity between the virtuous ruler and the awakened bodhisattva. So it's interesting. We're going to look at these two kind of roles, these two ways of living, right? The ruler's main virtue is in his relations with society, right? How he protects and transforms those relations. So his focus is very much about his nation, country, state, right? The people he's ruling over, people he's guiding, right? So the main focus for him, the main virtue there is, how is he doing that? And how is he transforming the people and the relationships towards something wholesome, right? Bodhisattvas in this text are also regarded as kings in a certain kind of way. They're also focused on protection and transformation, but it's of all beings. It's not just those identified as I'm responsible for this state. Now, Bodhisattva is doing the same thing on a much larger scale. Bodhisattva is transforming all beings because that's their vow, right? So they cultivate qualities or virtues that support their practice and manifestation of Buddha nature. So that's their means of transformation. So according to the sutra, the basis for cultivating the virtues sort of necessary for both the humane ruler and the bodhisattva is the perfection of forbearance, endurance, patience, tolerance, right? Here's the underlying key that's tying these two things together. So it includes this list of 5 forbearances, of which the third is our gate statement, right? Endurance of obedient following, or moving toward the end of mortality. So the text makes the use of a pun in Chinese where the word for humaneness and the word for tolerance has the same sound, and that's another sort of connection between these two roles, these two archetypes, if you will. So we can see how it's setting up this parallel between the humane ruler and the bodhisattva who's cultivated patience. So the text makes reference to one of the Jataka tales, the story of Shakyamuni's previous lives. This tale is called The Preacher of Forbearance. So in this particular life, Buddha is an ascetic who practices the perfection of patience. This is his main sort of practice. Local king believes that Buddha in this form has somehow lured his concubines away. So this ruler is feeling like something's been taken from him. Something's been stolen from him. So he starts harassing this ascetic. And it escalates until he really assaults him pretty viciously, pretty mercilessly. But of course, in the end of the story, the Buddha wins because he refuses to become angry at the way he's being treated, at the injustice that's been shown to him, at the physical assault that's going on for him. So he shows his sort of inward mastery of forbearance. This makes him sort of a realized person, right? What we're seeing is his mastery based on patience, based on forbearance. The king in this story, on the other hand, has shown his complete lack of mastery over himself. Self-control was the first thing on the list, right? That's gone out the window. So he's not mastered any of that stuff. He has no mastery over himself. He has no mastery over anybody else. And yet, from the outside, it looks like this is the person in power. This is the king, this is the ruler, right? This is the person in power. Outwardly, it looks that way. Inwardly, clearly not. So the story is really setting up a parallel for us to see what is real power, right? What is real mastery? It's based on tolerance. It's based on forbearance. So the sutra makes the point that both the humane king and the bodhisattva, as the king of forbearance, if you will, are engaged in the transformation of people. So both of them are cultivating and protecting their states. Right? So for the king, the state is literally the state, the nation, right? His people. and the way that's functioning, all the systems that function in there. For the bodhisattva, the state is his or her personal condition, right? So interestingly, in English, that works out that way. It's protection of the state. So which state are you protecting? And is there a difference? And that could be a long conversation, right? So we can see a connection here between inner and outer mastery, inner and outer authority, inner and outer skillful means. Or we might say, wisdom or skillful beneficial action. So we have the outer kingship, benevolently ruling a nation. And of course, there are many places in our lives where we're in charge of people. So we can, transplant this onto benevolently taking care of our staff that we supervise, or benevolently taking care of the family or the students, or whatever that means, right? We have the outer guidance, governance of that. We have the inner kingship, if you will, of patience, and all the other paramitas that form the basis of embodying awakening and actually ruling ourselves, right? Having some self-control. So the king works for the good of his people. Bodhisattva works for the good of all beings. And there's some relationship there. So the sutra sets up a hierarchy that says the more Buddha fields in which a bodhisattva lives, the greater a king he is. So the more heavenly realms he presides over. So in the sutra says, this is what is meant by bodhisattva mahasattvas appearing as kings in order to transform and guide sentient beings. So though it might look like kings and bodhisattvas are kind of on a separate path, separate plane, it's simply a difference of appearance. Actually, they're doing the same thing. So, ruler might be coming to guide more and more territory. Bodhisattva is sort of existing in more and more Buddha fields. And all of that is about transformation, transforming people. So the outer goal of the humane king involves transformation of the state. The inner goal is the cultivation of Buddhahood and the transforming of sentient beings through forbearance. So in this forbearance, there's certainly an element of being patient with people's shortcomings, right? People's mistakes. Sutra says, hearing of good, he is not overjoyed. Hearing of bad, he is not angry. So, developing some sort of patience, tolerance for people being people. People are human, right? We might be good at something. We're teaching someone who's not good at something. We need some patience, some tolerance. But we can't forget this aspect of endurance of obedient following. So the sutra equates being a humane king with explaining the Dharma and modeling or encouraging virtue. So in order to assume any kind of mastery, we have to be in accord with the Dharma. So no matter what it is, whatever kind of mastery it is we're going for, somehow we have to be in accord with the Dharma for that to actually manifest, unfold, right? So again, putting aside our own stuff, committing to following or integrating teachings. And this is true of the Dharma, but it's true of anything we learn, right? If you're learning music or you're learning sports or you're learning to read or anything, got to put our stuff over here. Commit to following teachings, integrating teachings, obedient following, right? That's when something happens. So you might remember an old story in this tradition where somebody comes to visit a Zen teacher, a Zen master, who's quite full of himself. And he's talking about himself. And Zen teacher quietly gets out the tea and starts to pour the tea, and is pouring and doesn't stop until the person says, wait a minute, that's going to overflow. Well, of course, it's a metaphor for this person has not emptied anything out. There's no room for teachings to go in, just like there's no room for more tea in the cup, right? So somehow obedient following, we got to suspend our stuff because we don't have room for anything else. So the title of king goes with self-transformation first. Starts here, no matter how big your staff is, no matter how big your working group is, your nation state is. King starts with this. Otherwise, it would be difficult for this sutra to equate bodhisattvas with kings. So the humane king goes with being able to protect the state. You can be a king and have nominal power, but humane king, virtuous king, awakened king means you can protect the state. You can transform beings, right? You're looking at the good of other beings. So that happens because the humane king puts things in order according to the Dharma, according to this sutra, right? So if you're ruling by Dharma, if you will, you've got things in order. Universe is doing what the universe does, and we can respond appropriately, and that sort of obedient following is what makes for a humane state. It allows us to take care of people. So he's doing, king is putting things in order according to Dharma, but doing it in a very even-handed, quiet, unobtrusive way. This is not saying every ruler needs to get on a soapbox and start waving his or her arms and forcing something. This is not about forcing something, right? We do this in a very quiet, unobtrusive way. So interestingly, I spent many years working for the government. And you would think that working for the government and being, at that time, clergy in training is a set of odd bedfellows. But it was interesting to me how often I could take my practice to work and how much I could influence people in a very quiet way simply by saying something people didn't expect, which in my mind was Dharma teaching. But I couldn't be overt about that. I'm in a government office, right? You got to be careful. I even wrote a speech for the head of our entire agency. It was an internal speech, fortunately. We'd just gone through some transition, and I based this entire thing on sort of the still center in the midst of turmoil. And if any of you ever looked at that, you'd go, that's a Dharma talk, right? So my intention was not to give to put a Dharma talk in his mouth. My intention was to respond to what was going on. But it's really interesting if we are simply acting from our understanding, how often that will come out, even in a place where you wouldn't expect it to come out. So even if you're in charge of a committee or a project or something, it's interesting how you will see that come out of yourself when you're practicing, but in a very quiet, unobtrusive way. So king is protected from making mistakes because of this obedient following, and therefore the state is also protected. So we're protected if we're practicing, carefully paying attention, listening to Buddha. We're protected from making mistakes, and the downstream of that is we're not perpetuating suffering on other people, right? We're protecting the people around us. We can give fearlessness is another way we put that, right? If we're protected from that, other people are protected from that, because we know we're not separate from other people, even if we're not in positions of authority. What we do affects people, right? So starts here. All starts with the self. So in this sutra, the goal of both the humane king and the bodhisattva is this internal transformation, inner transformation that manifests externally as skillful action. So we can't really do skillful action if we're not paying attention to what starts here, right? So there's another whole layer that's being alluded to here as well, and that's the two truths, or the relative and the absolute, or the form and the emptiness. That's all mixed up in this as well. So we have the king working in the world, we have the bodhisattva sort of functioning in emptiness, and we could say, well, those are two kind of different things. And we also know these two realms, these two people, these two kings, these two beings are not different, are not separate. So because these two realms and these two people are functioning according to endurance of obedient following, they're both empty, right? So in other words, they have no permanent self-nature because the causes and conditions that are leading to their arising are always changing, right? This is basic teaching for us. So if we put ourselves in the place of the humane king and the bodhisattva and we consider what they're aspiring to do, cultivate some mastery over themselves, their situations, for the good of others as well as themselves, and then remembering that everything around them is changing all the time and there's nothing they can really hold on to. Well, that certainly takes some patience, right? We've taken a vow, we have an aspiration, we're going to do some self-cultivation, we're going to look inwardly, we're going to do our practice for the good of ourselves as well as other beings, and then as fast as we're trying to do that, everything around us is changing all the time, right? So in the midst of trying to gain some quote-unquote mastery, something I can hold on to and say, yes, I get this. This is my tool now, I can use this, or this is my understanding. Everything is swirling. Everything is changing. So to have a vow and to walk a path in the midst of change requires an incredible amount of patience, right? We've probably all been there. Really, tolerance, patience, endurance become really important, and they're tied to our ability to make right effort, right, and diligence, and all of the things that go with that. So, you're going along, here you come up with this wonderful project, It's going to change lives. You're really committed to it, whatever your life project is, whatever your aspiration is. You're working hard to gather all the resources, right? Build everything you need, build the relationships. You're starting to make progress, you're helping people. Then the tornado comes along, right? Flattens the facility. You get to start all over. So, holy mackerel, how do you not get frustrated? How do you not get dismayed, right? How do you not get discouraged? And yet, we know there's no one to blame, right? Tornado is doing what tornado does. Universe is doing what universe does. So, we can see that if we're engaged in this obedient following, and we're not getting caught up in the impatience that goes with self-involvement in 3 poisons, and moment by moment by moment, everything can change despite our best sort of risk management efforts. So we go forward knowing, in this moment, I make my best effort, and yet, something can happen. Causes and conditions change, something happens, back to the beginning, right? So it can sure feel like nirvana is pretty far away in the midst of that. And yet, bodhisattvas know there's no use getting impatient. It's not going to change anything. We can be impatient for an outcome, and maybe it sort of keeps us focused a bit and keeps us on track and keeps us sort of engaged. But ultimately, impatience based on some kind of self-clinging is not going to change anything. So it can't move samsara and nirvana any closer together. If I'm impatient for these, if I'm in samsara moving to nirvana, my impatience doesn't shorten that distance. It probably makes it greater, right? I'm creating separation there. No matter what it looks like, somehow they're both right here. So our impatience isn't going to make a difference. Endurance of obedient following is a gate of Dharma-illumination, for with it we obey the Dharma of all the Buddhas. Now, interestingly, we might think of endurance or patience as something that's kind of abstract. You can't draw a picture of it. You can't hold on to it. So it feels like something kind of out there. But actually, we need to remember it's something we practice. So that means it's related to the places where we create karma, body, speech, and mind, right? How do we relate patience or endurance of obedient following to body, speech, and mind? Well, thought leads to speech, also leads to action, and we can attune ourselves to sort of feeling when impatience is arising. There might be something we actually feel in the body and mind. When we can feel that, right, that impatience arising. We can remember that probably our impatience is based on not being in accord with the Dharma. Somehow, there's something out of alignment. There's something out of whack, and this impatience kind of arises. It's a wonderful sort of reminder. Oh yeah, wait a minute. Endurance of obedient following. What is in alignment with Buddha's teaching, and how am I sort of missing that? So, when that comes up, it's a time to step back and go, maybe I've got some expectation that the universe isn't meeting at this moment, and like, how realistic is that? Where did that expectation come from? Is it part of my story? What's going on? Is that an expectation I need to adjust or let go of? So, endurance of obedient following is not about feeling like we're under the thumb of some sort of outside force. And this is why I say patience can feel abstract, because it can feel like, well, endurance just means something out here is being imposed on me and I have to put up with it, maybe with a smile, right? Probably the dictator in that story is our own ego, but be that as it may, right? Endurance might make us think we need to be martyrs, or we need to put up with unfair treatment, and oh well, this is the practice and this is the universe doing what the universe does, and so, I just need to accept this unwholesome, unhealthy kind of situation. Endurance is not better than action. This is not saying we endure without acting. So it shouldn't paralyze us in carrying out our vows. That's not obedient following. So Todo-san has reminded us we should try to see the whole situation and do what's best for everyone. If we aim only for patience, we may harm ourselves or others. Patience alone can be a kind of poison. It can make the situation worse. Wisdom, patience without compassion, patience without insight, not so helpful, and probably not in alignment with the Dharma. So this is really about seeing clearly what the universe is doing, what's really happening beyond what we expect to happen, what we want to happen, right? What's happened before. So many of us in this room are wearing some kind of okesa or rakusu, or some kind of robe. Some of us are about to be wearing those things soon. And, we may be surprised to know that one of the names for this robe is the robe of patience. I think that's really interesting. Really, what better opportunity do we have for obedient following than putting these things on? There's a reason, like we do a chant and we go through how we put these things on in a really intentional kind of way. What better opportunity do we have then for obedient following than when we've done those things and we're wearing Buddha's robe? We're actually wearing Buddha's teaching. What an opportunity to be in alignment with this thing, right? We've got it physically, actually wrapped around our bodies. We're in intimate contact with it. So we could have a long conversation about how this is also sort of armor, protection. We've talked about protecting the state. Which state are you protecting? So, it is another matter of protection, protecting our attitude, protecting our practice. So the robe of forbearance, or the robe of endurance, comes from the 10th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, called the Teacher of the Law. So we're not making this up. It comes from the sutra. So in addition to the sort of cloth robe, it's an image or a symbol of putting on the spirit of forbearance, the spirit of being in accord, in order to teach the Dharma, in order to teach the sutra. So the robe protects against the external hindrances, physical hindrances, mental hindrances, if you will. So the sutra refers to the robe of gentleness and patience. It says that if you want to preach the sutra after Shakyamuni's death, you should put on the thus come one's robe, and this robe is the mind of gentleness and forbearance. So the robe and patience are being equated. The robe and the patience are the same thing. We put this on, we put on a particular attitude because we're going to share the Dharma in some way. I mean, this is saying teach, but, share, embody the Dharma. So there are 3 essentials or 3 rules for preaching the Lotus Sutra. So the robe, the seat, and the room of the thus come one, or Buddha. So we'll talk about each of these, right? The robe, the seat, and the room of the thus come one. So all of these are aspects of mind that we put on, if you will, before we teach and practice. So next time we put these things on, we can sort of bear that in mind. So the sutra says, these good men and good women should enter the thus come one's room, put on the thus come one's robe, sit in the thus come one's seat, and then for the sake of the 4 kinds of believers, monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen, broadly expound this sutra. The thus come one's room is the state of mind that shows great pity and compassion toward all living beings. The thus come one's robe is the mind that is gentle and forbearing. The thus come one's seat is the emptiness of all phenomena. So before we share the Dharma, we sort of bring forth our gentleness, our forbearance, wisdom, compassion, right? So the robe helps us to be in accord with and embody Buddha's teachings. So it takes patience and endurance, we know, to study and construct rakusu and okesa. We have people engaged in it even now. And it's not always an easy practice, an easy path. You make a mistake. You get to take all that out. You get to do it again. We've all been there. So even if you know about regular sewing, even if you come in with a fair amount of background in regular sewing, this is not regular sewing. In some ways, it's harder if you come in knowing something about sewing, because you really have to take all that, put it over here. It's not easy, and we make assumptions. So this is not like everyday sewing in terms of technique or in terms of attitude. It's a very particular practice because we take it as practice. So you have to put aside your desire. Now we're talking about enduring obedient following, enduring putting aside our stuff. You have to put aside your idea that you're going to make a pretty art project. It's going to express all your inner stuff, right? Or that you're going to make something impressive. You're going to make the best rakusu that was ever made. Or you're going to copy some cool thing you saw. I mean, I saw plenty of cool okesas in Japan. You kind of have to put aside your idea that you're going to copy some, cool thing you saw, that you saw somebody else wear, maybe even something in a slightly different style because it looks really nice, right? So in this family, we're very careful to carry out the particular Nyohoe teachings of our ancestor Kodo Sawaki during his 20th century Nyohoe movement. So if you make a robe here, You need to, you need to endure your disappointment perhaps about making something else. It will not be flashy. It will be a particular way. It will only have certain colors, right? We get to put aside our ideas about all of that. So it can be a real practice, I think, of obedient following. So when I made my zagu for transmission, I copied the commercial zagus that you see from Sotoshu because I didn't realize it was any different than Sanshin style. And I thought, well, I'm going to be in accord, right, by looking like all the Sotoshu people that I know. You may have noticed that last year I took it apart and I took out all the white cloth because this had white cloth on the front and white cloth on the back. White cloth is not Nyohei. And I'd been, using it that way for quite some time. Well, when we really got started with the Sawaki Nyohei Treasury and we really started articulating our practice about that, I thought, well, this is now not okay. It was never okay, but now it's really not okay, right? So if anyone's going to be sort of an obedient follower, if you will, from the Sawaki Nyohei movement, better be the person who's in charge of the practice here, right? Otherwise, what kind of an example am I setting? So, was it a nuisance to pull that whole thing apart? Sure. But it felt like it was important to do it. It was important to be patient with that for the sake of other people who see that and think, oh, that's okay. Or, that's the way they do it at Sanshin. And it's not the case, right? So obedient following meant, well, got to do something else, got to pivot, right? So that's a simple thing, but it's an example, right? Because these things become visible, and people look at that as an example. We've actually had people confused by the kind of Raksu you're seeing Todo-san wear today. I wear them too, that has the applique. People, say, oh, I want to make, that's pretty, I want to make one like that. And then we have to go, no, it's not about being pretty. So you may have noticed at Yuko's request, I've stopped wearing mine around here because people were attached to that style, right? That's the kind of Raksu you make when you've only got this much fabric. Right? That's not sort of a design choice. That's about, so the one I have is 100-year-old fabric and that's all I had, just that square. So I made that style to honor that fabric, but it was confusing to people. Right? So we get to put aside our ideas about what is this whole robe thing about? And under endurance of obedient following, we do the style of this place. So I should say, by the way, if you're interested in learning more about robe colors, I mentioned some colors are okay and some are not. We've just posted a translation of a new chapter of Great Robe of Liberation, and it's linked from the Sawaki Treasury, which is all about colors, robe colors. So you'll see little by little those chapters are being translated, and that's out there for everybody to look at. So go have a look. Okay, so if you've studied with Yuko and you've studied robe sewing, you have heard the phrase Eho Ichi Nyo, which is robe and Dharma are one. So that's actually a really important component of beginning to wear these things. So the sewing here is not just about technical construction, it's also about what is the Dharma of that, right? Robe and the Dharma are one. So putting a robe on this body, whatever that robe looks like, is a skillful action towards saving beings, liberating beings. So we can't help but engage in obedient following when we wear these things, right? So I'm sure remember the story, I've told it more than once, when I was in the training temple, anytime we had to leave on temple business, we had to wear jigitotsu and raksu. We couldn't just wear samue, because the Roshi said, when people see monks, they can't do anything bad, right? So if they see us looking like this, they can't do anything bad. There's something about, would it have been easier to put on samue, put on street clothes, put on something else? Yes, but under endurance of obedient following, we did as we were asked because there was a real component there about protecting people's practice and protecting people's ability not to break precepts, right? So when you're wearing your raksu, when you're wearing your okesa, it's about more than just you. So overall message of today's gate, be patient with the practice. Be patient with yourself as a practitioner. Be patient with the practice. It is no fun to get up at 3:30 in the morning to start sesshin at 4. Nobody would probably willingly do that. That's what the Sangha's doing during a certain, time. So that's what we're going to do. It's okay, it's time for zazen. Well, it means putting down that interesting thing we're doing and getting on a cushion here or at home if you're practicing virtually, because it's time to do it. The bell is ringing, we just don't need to have an idea about that. We get on the cushion. So it's hard to let go of our deeply held delusion our deeply held self-clinging, but that is the practice of the Bodhisattva, so that's what we have vowed to do. That, under the umbrella of endurance of obedient following, that's how we go forward. So what would you like to say about endurance of obedient following, being in accord with Dharma? Questions about any of that or reflections? I'll start with the people here and give people at home time to decide what they're going to do. So questions, comments, reflections here in the room? All right. Anybody at home? Oh, Sawyer, please.
Okay. I'm really interested in the sort of opposition or pairing of the Bodhisattva and the ruler.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah. And the way that, so the way that you talked about it during part of your talk was about sort of the inner and outer side of how this sort of humaneness manifests, and that the Bodhisattva, in a sense, is more towards that inner way of practice, and that the king, the ruler, is sort of concerned with the circumstances of the beings within their state, and that the Bodhisattva is sort of concerned with the inner state. At least that's part of what you were saying.
It's part of it.
Because at the same time, the Bodhisattva has a sort of wider exterior feel.
Yes.
So I wonder about that, sort of like that the Bodhisattva is sort of governing all beings, but is also simultaneously like maybe more concerned with governing the inner state than a king would be.
Yeah, so I think, there's so many ways to look at this. I tried to give you several aspects, several gateways into this thing. There's a lot of ways to look at this. So of course we know the Bodhisattva is not concerned only with the inner, because the inner is the basis of skillful action. So I think the point this sutra is making is that it starts here. We can't take skillful action unless we're also thinking about what's going on here, right? So in a way, it sets the sutra sort of sets up a contrast. We've got a ruler focused on something, ruling the state, and we've got a bodhisattva concerned with something else. But then it also says, and by the way, not different. So I would not want to set this. I would not want to set up an image that says, well, the king is us and the bodhisattva is someone else, or that the king is someone else and the bodhisattva is here, because it's the same thing. So the work of this king is governing, but we've all got relations in the world, right? We've all got responsibilities in the world. So how do we protect our practice, protect our attitude? And protect is an interesting word, because protect can feel like, well, I'm going to shut myself off so you don't contaminate me, right? It's not about that. It's like, how do we encourage our practice and stay on the path and stay focused in such a way that we become skillful bodhisattvas, and then what we do in the world is also skillful, on behalf of beings. So please don't draw too many boxes around what I just put out there. It's multiple ways to kind of look at the same thing. Because, we've got form and emptiness, so that particular comparison, might be, well, king is in the world of form, king is in the world of samsara, bodhisattva is in the world of emptiness, or the world of nirvana. And of course, those are not actually separate, right? So there's an inner and outer to both. I think it doesn't matter what our aspiration is, what our role in society is, what our responsibilities are to people. There's a reason we sit zazen, and there are days when it can be difficult to sort of accept, well, this zazen is for the benefit of all beings, because, like, how does that happen? Or what I would hear most often from first-timers in Japan was, there's all this liturgy, what the hell, what difference does that make? I want to sit. well, this liturgy is on behalf of all beings. So it does, and it can sometimes not feel like that, right? So can we simply get on the cushion? Can we do the practice? Can we protect the mind state? Can we, encourage ourselves, knowing that this kind of inner cultivation is what makes it possible to do the bodhisattva work in the world and to carry out vows, right? Are we going to fall short sometimes? Yes. That's why there's repentance, because our practice is never complete. So we just keep going, keep doing it, right? We're going to make mistakes, but that's what goes with being in this karmic human form. So, the king and the bodhisattva, are they two different people? Are they not two different people? We get to sort of practice with that. What else would you like to say about that?
Yeah, I was thinking also about, like when you talk about protecting our practice and sort of being concerned with the conditions that allow practice to happen.
Yep.
Which is not a guarantee. This space might not exist, and then how would we practice? But I was thinking about in Dogen's life and times, his move from Kyoto to Echizen, so to move from the city, he was practicing in the city, all people all around, political intrigues and all of that, and then there was a conscious decision to sort of escape, in a sense, all of what the king is sort of concerned with, and so he went away with a small group into the mountains, and they established a sort of protected practice place there. And that's always been an interesting tension to me, because of course all of us are really right in the midst of Kyoto in a sense, like we are, and even probably more, because there's no monastery, or there's no separate place. We just go out and live in this world, and so yeah, that's just a further kind of wrinkle between this, what Dogen did, and then what we do.
But interestingly, there are certainly training temples that have a city place and a country place. A city place and a mountain place, right? So I think there's some recognition that from time to time, at least, it is useful to get away from the distraction that goes with that city life. Not to reject it, because we're going back to it, right? It's not about saying that's bad, this is good. It's just from time to time, can we create a container that really allows us to focus on practice? So having been to some of those places and lived in some of those places, there's a real difference. When I was at Hokyoji, it was a 45-minute drive to the nearest major town to get food, which is not what was going on, in city places. So there's a real difference there. I think we have to be careful not to say one is better than the other. I think so to me, I see a parallel. You'll appreciate this because we've talked about it many times. I see a parallel between the city and the mountain thing and the annual calendar of our practice, which says we do sesshin and then we relax. We do ango and then we relax, right? We need to move between these two things. So how can we create conditions where we focus intensively on practice and then return to the marketplace with bliss-bestowing hands, right? How do we go back into the world and take that practice into the world and carry out our vows as bodhisattvas to liberate beings? We need both of those things. So, could we practice without this zendo? Sure. Did we do it during the pandemic? Absolutely. I mean, there's proof positive. We were sitting at home. It wasn't ideal. It was a challenge, but people kept sitting and we kept practicing, right? So, do you need a perfect circumstance in order to practice? No. If we're waiting for that, we're never going to practice, right? We know practice is right here, right now, this moment. There's nowhere else to go. And yet, if we could create circumstances that support practice, wouldn't we do that? And that includes a quiet place and, some place that's warm enough and dry enough and, has enough light and heat and practitioners, right? Sangha is an important part of that. We all know it's really hard to practice on your own. It's probably how you got here, or to wherever your Sangha is, right? So we could create those perfect conditions, but if we're waiting for those, we've got a problem. So if we're moving into conditions that are more supportive for practice, are we escaping something? I think we have to be thoughtful about that, right? I don't think we can set up one moment or one place as a perfect practice place. Are we escaping from something? Are we simply moving between two circumstances that allow us to sort of see our practice more clearly and to focus on certain parts of our practice? So when we're in Sesshin, we eat, sleep, and sit, and that's literally all we do. We get to focus on eating, sleeping, and sitting. And now that we've reinstituted Oryoki practice, we get to really focus on what meal practice is in a way that we've not been able to before. So we get to focus on that. Outside of Sesshin, we're going to focus on other things. Perhaps it's being in the world. Perhaps it's helping other beings, or doing whatever our responsibilities in the world are. And then we focus on that, right? So it's not that one form is better than another, but having that sort of series of ecosystems, if you will, for our practice is really useful and quite beneficial, right? So when we go to Japan to train, that's a particular container. We get something out of that. That's not what we're doing here, and it wouldn't be appropriate to do it here, right? So we need all of those different kind of arenas for practice. Broadens our perspective, I think, a bit, right? So Dogen was moving for some very particular reasons. He's having some real challenges. In order to protect the practice, he had to do something else, right? So I think we have to be thoughtful about protecting the practice. I mean, to me that feels, I like it because it feels like, oh, I'm being really intentional about the circumstances of my practice in this moment, but it can't be, I'm protecting this from you. I'm protecting this from the world, right? Because there's no real barrier here. It just has to be, it's about my own sort of focus or approach or something, right? What would others like to say? That or anything else? Oh, hands are going up, please.
That classic story, I think it comes from the yogic tradition. I keep hearing it from different contexts. About the practitioner who goes up into the mountain. And he lives in a cave like Milarepa, perhaps that's a tradition. And he gets to the point where he feels like he's spiritually perfected. And he thinks, okay, I'm done here. And he wanders back into the town, and somebody bumps up against him and says, "What are you doing?" Which actually brings us to the whole point of anger. Because it's easy to avoid anger if you don't expose yourself to anything that creates that anger.
That's right.
And sort of in the tantric tradition that, anger is an energy. You just drop the narrative and be with the energy. But you also have to have the stimulus, you have to have the circumstances, you have to know what pushes your buttons in order to process that
Yes,
trauma.
that's right. So I think it's the same teaching that says, we can befriend suffering because if it wasn't for suffering, we wouldn't be practicing. Or, we really need to be in a Sangha because it's like a rock polisher. It knocks all of our corners off because we get, bumped into by people.
Is it potatoes?
Potatoes, yeah, cleaning the potatoes or cleaning the rock. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that story comes up too, right? So if we're not in the world, in the functioning of the world, we're not in accord with Dharma. We're really cut off from things. And do we need to, endure obedient following? Yes, because having your corners knocked off is not pretty, right? But development, cultivation, virtue, practice, awakening somehow comes, in the midst of that. So we need to put ourselves in those places. So yeah, it's a test, isn't it? We can think we've completely let go of all of our greed, anger, and ignorance, and then you go out of the zendo and stub your toe, and then what comes up? We're not done yet. What would others like to say? I saw some hands. Sagan.
Yeah, in reference to what you were saying about protecting the mind state, reminded me very much of Dogen's teaching about gyoji, preserving or maintaining practice. He talks a lot about the importance of, continuing. Yeah, continuous practice. So when are we done? We're never done. So whatever circumstances we're in, we always hear things like, well, we should be able to sit zazen in the train station or in the bus station or in the midst of the shopping center, right? Can we do that? Sure. Is that a challenge? Probably so. and yet, right? So wherever we are, we're practicing. And we can put ourselves in interesting places to sort of have the experience of not protecting ourselves in a way which cuts us off. Protection can be about cutting off, and that's not what we want to be doing, right? Other things from people here or at home? Oh, Owen, please.
just kind of an interesting thing maybe. Plato's Republic actually is like structured in a very similar way to that sutra you're talking about. That the way that the city should be run is like kind of parallels the inner world of like a virtuous person. Now, of course, he puts priority on reason, which is kind of an interesting distinction from wisdom. But I thought that's just kind of an interesting thing. But the thing I'm maybe curious about is I see a chicken and the egg problem with like patience and wisdom. Yes, like I think you kind of need one to do the other.
Yep.
Which I think is very relevant for, for example, in my job, like, do you start with the wisdom, do you start with the patience, how do you do both at once? And I mean, within your own zazen, right? Like you might be, oh, I'm very restless today, which I've been experiencing recently. I was telling you about my itchy little face. Yeah, so I'm feeling very restless, but how do I have the wisdom to like see through that and sit through it, and then but maybe it is the wise thing to allow me to be restless. So both internally and like trying to support other people, I see like a chicken and the egg, and I wonder what you see with that.
Yeah, well, so you've identified something which is comes up frequently in our practice, which is that I can talk about any one aspect of practice, but actually it's an artificial distinction because everything arises together. Greed, anger, and ignorance arise together. All the paramitas arise together. The Eightfold Path is not a matter of going from one to the next. All of these things arise together. Wisdom and compassion, wisdom and patience, right, arise together. So, and kind of for the same reasons that we're never done with practice. So we have some insight, we do some skillful action, we do some practice, which reinforces our practice, right? So it is a bit chicken and egg in that you can't say one came before the other. Things may arise with different intensity, right? But they're all arising together. So provisionally I can talk about patience as separate from something else, as separate from wisdom. But the real situation is you've identified. They're not actually separate, right? So if we're sitting zazen and stuff is going on, can we just keep letting go of our stuff? Letting go of our thoughts about it, our judgments about it, our stories about it. I don't have to, if I'm sitting, I don't have to label, oh, this is patience. Oh, now I need to exercise wisdom. I can just, right? And just sit, and what comes up is what comes up. And then it might be the important thing to do is, scratch that thing. Or, do what you need to do. But we don't need to have an opinion about it. And that's where the barrier comes in, right? Other things from folks? Questions, reflections,
We do have a question.
things to share.
From Abby.
Abby, good to see you, Abby.
Yes, good to see you. And thank you for that talk. There was a paradigm in your talk that interested me, and I seem to have skipped a little piece of it. So I'm wondering if you could sort of resupply me. It was about the robe, the seat, and the thus come one's room. And I got that the robe was equated with compassion and the seat with emptiness, but I lost the piece about the thus come one's room.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Elucidate that a little, I would appreciate it.
Yep. So again, Abby is taking us back to the three essentials, or the three rules for preaching the Lotus Sutra. So we have the robe, the seat, and the room of the thus come one. So I want to get to something that's not going to, I don't want to give this, give the whole talk again. Okay, so let's see. So the thus come one's room is the state of mind that shows great pity and compassion toward all living beings. So this is the broadest possible space, right? Thus come one's robe is the mind that is gentle and forbearing, and the thus come one's seat is the emptiness of all phenomena. In other words, that's the basis of, right? That's the seat. That's the basis of everything that we're doing. And if you want to, Abby, I can send you a link to this sutra. You can read the sutra for yourself and get the specifics of that. So this is mostly saying before we're sharing the Dharma, practicing, teaching the sutra, pity, compassion, gentle, forbearing, emptiness. Is that enough about that, or do you want to follow up?
I would like a follow-up, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you have something else on that?
No, I just...
No, you're done. Okay. Okay. Other questions, comments? I think it's an interesting piece of the sutra, right? I get a mental image from that, which I want to kind of noodle on some more. Other people at home? Okay. I think we're good. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. Let's do our closing chant, and we'll move on to some announcements.